a two-part, 2-week look at church leadership. I'll be looking at pastors and deacons this morning, and then Ron's going to teach next week on congregationalism. And so I won't be here next week. I'm going to be preaching down at a friend's church in Georgia for their homecoming in Canaan, Georgia, just outside of Hartwell, Georgia. And Ron will be teaching, and then Travis Kearns from Three Rivers Baptist Association will be preaching in our service next Sunday. Just heads up on that. But before we look at church leadership, I wanted to wrap up our look at the Lord's Supper. There were a few questions that we didn't really have time to get to, one of which, let's think about, okay, what are the proper elements to be used in the Lord's Supper? And then another is who ought to participate in the Lord's Supper. So I just wanted to briefly address those questions, and then we'll get into church leadership. So the first question would be, what are the proper elements? And so if you grew up in a Southern Baptist church around here, you most likely grew up with the bread being not actually bread, but a little cracker, a little wafer of some sort. We were talking last week at the end, after COVID, there were the prepackaged versions of the communion elements, and you peeled back the foil, and what was inside was more like foam than anything else. Here we use real bread, and the reason we use real bread, a couple of reasons. One is the symbolism of nourishment. Like real bread, if you look throughout the Bible, bread is there. I mean, even the raw materials for bread kind of mentioned there in Genesis 1, talking about with the grain that is created. And so bread is throughout the Bible, has spiritual significance in symbolic ways, and it has physical significance in that it's nourishing. And so I think you have the symbolism of nourishment when we use real bread. Loaves rather than wafers also, they're actually broken. And so it comes out of the oven a loaf, and by the time it gets to us, it's in little pieces, it's been broken. And Jesus says, this is my body broken for you. So there's symbolism there. There's also the unity, that we're all eating from one loaf. You might have that symbolism a little more if we tore off rather than have the pieces cut up. But still, it is one loaf that we're all eating from, and there's there's symbolism of unity there. Obviously, when a church gets to a certain size, you don't have one loaf, but where we are now, we can preserve that symbolism. And then also having leavened bread, I think, is fitting after post-resurrection. So I think there's some symbolic reasons there for why that is fitting. And so that's the reason we use real bread. Then you have the cup. And so I think as Baptists, we need to be honest about why we use grape juice. And the reason we use grape juice is because of the late 19th century temperance movement. Prior to that, Baptists didn't use grape juice. That's because Thomas Welch hadn't invented it yet. And so there's all sorts of things kind of, from that movement that led to churches of our tradition using grape juice. So the question is, should we use grape juice or should we use real wine? So let me address that from a couple of different angles. One is, if you're just asking me what my personal belief, if I started from scratch somewhere, I would say that using actual wine is better it's more fitting for communion for these reasons. One, it's what Jesus used, it's what was instituted. Two, it is a fitting symbol of the gospel. Wine is. You have grapes. They were crushed. They were entombed, put in a cellar, and for a period of time to ferment and all of that, and then resurrected as glorified grapes. So it is a fitting representation of the gospel. Just the process of making wine, which is why I think Jesus used it. Why it's used throughout the Bible in a number of different ways. I would say that wine is potent, like the gospel is. And it's a symbol of maturity and judicial wisdom. So if you look throughout the Bible, wine is a kingly drink. It is for those who are mature and those who rule. And that fits with our view of believers' baptism and congregationalism, where the congregation has authority. And so, so all of that said, I would say that wine is a more fitting element to be used in the Lord's Supper. That being said, the effects of the 19th century temperance movement are still with us. And so the reason, why do we use grape juice currently? I'm unwilling to take what is meant for a time of great unity and fellowship for our church and to make it a cause for division. Because whether we like it or not, the issue of alcohol, whether in just use drinking it or use in the Lord's Supper, is a contentious matter, and so at this point it's not worth the division of it to make a flat change. And so I think the process of wine making informs our thinking on this matter, which is like winemaking takes patience. There's a lot of things in this world that take patience, and there's a lot of things in the Christian life that take patience because things are slow to develop, and so I would say patience is necessary. If you are convinced, that it is more fitting to use real wine rather than grape juice, I would want to agree with you, but I would also encourage patience in that, and I think. Lastly on that the use of grape juice is not sinful, it's just not the most fitting. I think that's the way I would say that. It's not sinful. Some would say it is. I don't think there's a good case for that, but I do think that it is not the most fitting, and so, over time, we'll see where that leads us, but we want to preserve unity in the church on that, not disunity and division. So that would be my take on the elements. And then the second question is, who may partake? And so there's basically three different views that we kind of have to wrestle with. One is open communion, anybody can come take it. Two is closed communion, with the D on the end, closed. That is, only members of our church may take communion. And then there's a called close communion, which is baptized believers in good standing in a church of like faith and order may partake of communion. And that is more or less our position here at First Baptist. We do not insist that someone be a member of this particular church. We fence the table that they must be baptized, and they must be repentant. They must be trusting Christ. So we'll baptize believers. That being said, we have visiting Presbyterians. Then, while I would say, based on our discussion of baptism a few weeks ago, that that's you're not actually baptized. Say they're baptized as an infant, yet we would serve them communion. And the rationale for that is what the Baptist Faith and Message says. That is that baptism is a church ordinance, and we would not accept them into membership with that infant baptism. But their church, where they're a member of, sees it as baptism, and so as an act of Christian hospitality, we would serve them communion. Also, I don't want to be in a position of denying table fellowship to someone that Christ does not deny table fellowship to. I think that would be a much graver error. And so, with that said, we do fence the table, and we do fence the table with the language that I used prior to serving. And then, but we don't, we're not physically fencing, we would do that if there's a discipline issue. But generally speaking, we fence it verbally, and then that is on the person's conscience of whether they partake or not. Yes, ma'am.
What do you call that last one?
Close communion.
Oh, close.
So there's closed,
Okay.
only members of the church, and then close communion is the term that's given to that other view. Any questions or thoughts on those? Kind of wrap up Lord's Supper discussion.
Along the line of nourishment.
Yes.
So we're given this little piece. How
Yes.
much should we eat and drink?
It's a good question. So I think within the worship service, there's a case to be made that communion originally was an actual meal. I think we're dealing in the realm of symbolism when we are doing the Lord's Supper as part of our worship service. And so I think that having a portion of bread and a portion of, the cup, juice, wine, whatever you're using, is symbolic. It stands in for a full meal. And so I think it's appropriate. I think in the life of the church, we ought to have times where we are sharing table fellowship together regularly. And the pattern of the Lord's Supper is then extended out. Not that when we get together down in the fellowship hall or the gym for a meal, that's the Lord's Supper. But it is, it's an extension. The Lord's Supper sets the pattern for that. And then we have, more physical nourishment there. But I think in the Lord's Supper, we're dealing in the realm of symbolism. And so I think that piece of bread, as small as it is, and that little cup, small as it is, represents something else that is much more nourishing physically and spiritually. Does that make sense? I don't know, what you think?
Well, sure, I mean, like Christ the King, they take a big piece of bread and then like any bread that's left over, it's not to be wasted, so it has to be consumed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even then, though, it's not a full meal. It's you're dealing in a portion representing something greater than itself, and all of it is representing Christ. And so I think the importance is the thing symbolized, the thing remembered, and so that is where and in the act of itself done in faith, and that is where God gives us through grace.
Yeah, I think their argument is good for it. Their argument is that they're trying to represent that there's an abundance and generosity also to the meal.
Yeah.
Which I get. On the wine perspective of it, I've always thought too that the dryness of the wine is almost like a bitterness that's introduced it. That reminds us also of the Lord's death.
Yeah.
Whereas with grape juice you don't get any of that. And then the purifying aspect of the wine being used in amounts back then. I don't think they really drank water without putting wine in it because of the bacterial concerns.
Yeah. I think it's laced with meaning. Let's look now at church leadership, and so basically we're talking about pastors and deacons this morning. Again, Ron will get into congregationalism next week, and why is this topic important? Would be kind of the first question that we ought to consider. Not everybody that's in the church is ever going to be a pastor or a deacon. So why should everybody in the church have a good understanding of church leadership? And I would say Hebrews 13:7 tells us that we ought to, we ought to honor our leaders and we ought to help them lead well. And so if we understand what they are to do, that helps everybody. And we also, being a Baptist church, we recognize that the congregation has authority, decision-making authority, in addition to, say, pastors and deacons. And so we should understand what all goes into that in all aspects of church leadership if we're going to be healthy together. And so the congregation has the most basic form of leadership in the church. It belongs to the congregation under Christ. Christ is the ultimate authority. The authority of pastors and deacons exists within or inside the authority of the congregation. In order to, particularly pastors' authority is to help equip the congregation to exercise their authority well. And we'll see a little bit more of that next week, maybe a little bit of the interplay between the two. But first, let's just think about what are the offices of the church. New Testament gives us two. You have pastors and deacons. Pastors, the word sometimes is pastor in the New Testament, sometimes it's elder, sometimes it's bishop. If you look at the Baptist Faith and Message, it uses those three interchangeably. That those are three terms used to all refer to the same office. So we don't recognize a hierarchy of of bishops in the same way that the Catholic Church or the Episcopalian Church or something would see that. We see pastors, elders, bishops, those three words referring to the same office. And then you have deacon, which is another office. And in our circles, there's been pendulum swings on the office of deacon. And so for a long time, the office of deacon was basically functional elders. Church didn't have elders or pastors, plural. They'd have one guy that they bring in, usually from outside of the congregation. And then, but you had the deacons that ran kind of like a board of directors. And it was a mix of board of directors or functional elders, and kind of ran the church, so to speak, right? And so almost all of the authority was invested in the deacons. And then as a reaction to that, because that's not the New Testament model, that isn't what a deacon does, according to the scriptures, in reaction to that, there's a pendulum swing to, deacons are, only servants, and by that, it kind of got, whether it was meant to be this way, or just kind of how it went, was basically they were ministry volunteers that got ordained for some reason, and they met once a month. It was not seen as a leadership office in the church, but only kind of a head ministry volunteer servant position. And I think the biblical office of deacon is something different. It is a leadership office. It is a leader. Deacons are those in the church who lead. The word for deacon, though, does mean servant, so they lead by serving, and they lead by serving in certain areas. And so the way that I've talked about it here is you have pastors who are have authority in the church in the heavenly matters of the church, and so worship, shepherding of souls, discipline, counseling, they're the ministry of the word, all of that. And then you have deacons who give leadership in the earthly affairs of the church, finances, properties, personnel, those type things. And so I think that is a healthy model of understanding of two different aspects of leadership. I think a good analogy is that of husbands and wives. A husband and a wife in a home are both, they're both leading in some ways. So you have a husband who's head of his house and is giving overall direction, and he's leading outward into the world, and wife who is the minister of domestic affairs at home, is kind of managing the household, to use the biblical terminology there. And so there's some real leadership there. Not that she's leading her husband, but she is leading in this area of the home underneath the leadership of her husband in these very much practical matters of the house. Whether that's the food, whether that's the kids' education, whether that's the budget, allocating, husband kind of, makes this amount and gives some broad parameters, and maybe she's the one who, oversees all of that at a granular level. And I think it's similar with pastors or elders and deacons. And so the deacons will manage those earthly affairs, the properties and the finances and everything, while the pastors give broad direction, bring the ministry of the word to those. How do we think, biblically about budgets? You're managing the budget, or leadership through the finance team, things of that nature. But still, there's a broad leadership of the pastors in the church, and ideally, just like ideally at home, those complement one another and work well together. Ideally, in the church, it does the same thing. I've mentioned pastors in the plural. When we went through 1 Timothy, we talked about this, but the New Testament norm, New Testament model, the New Testament pattern is that you have a plurality of pastors or plurality of elders, however you want to say that. And I want to make a little bit of a case for that. One is, that's what you see in the Bible. Like it's usually referred to in the plural. We already accept a plurality of deacons. We have 5 currently. And so I think it fits, if you look at the qualification, you look where the Bible talks about deacons, it's often talking about pastors right around the same place. And so I think it fits with that. I would say there's just, there's wisdom in it. One, just, there's wisdom in a multitude of counselors. There's wisdom in having that applied to the shepherding of the church. Particularly if you have lay pastors in a mobile society where people are always, moving around. I don't think that's healthy for the church, for pastors to be in and out every 3 years. That's not the model that I want to follow here. But it is a reality, and what ends up happening is one guy comes in, has all the authority kind of invested in him for certain things, and then he moves on in 2.5 years, either under good circumstances or bad, and it leaves the church in a lurch, and there's a lack of stability where if you had lay elders there, lay pastors there could be more stability for the church, anchor the church. If you have plurality, you have differing strengths to make up for and complement the differing weaknesses within the group. You don't have concentrated authority in one man, such that if he falls, or if he is corrupt, or if he is whatever it is, that it can all go really bad for a church really quickly. And so you don't want it to be if one man falls, the whole church falls. Again, you don't have stability. And then also, just concentrated authority in any one person generally doesn't go well. I think it is healthy if you have, you do need a leader, but you don't need an unchecked leader. And so I think a plurality helps there. And then there's just practically, shepherds need help, pastors need help. I was talking with Shannon about this not too long ago. Like there are situations that I would love to be able to talk with, and some particular church members in mind I'd love to talk with and get counsel on how to go about addressing this. And it would be appropriate if that person were a fellow elder, fellow pastor. It would not be appropriate to talk about some other situation in that same way with another church. In their office as church member, it wouldn't be appropriate. It would be talking about another church member situation, private situation in a way that maybe breaks some confidence. Where if they were a fellow pastor, it would be, assumed that we would be talking about how to best shepherd that person. Does that make sense? And so, just practically, just help to do that well. And so, all of that put together, I think, shows that a pastoral team is best for a congregation. And if you put all of what we just said together with the different offices, then I think the ideal for a church is pastor-led, deacon-served, congregationally ruled. And that would mark us different than other denominations. That's a distinctive of our Baptist ecclesiology. So let me pause there, and if there are any discussion, questions, comments, and then we'll keep on going. Yeah, come on.
Okay, from what you just said, so they are supposed to, like, the deacons, over properties, over finance, over this, shouldn't they then be the head of those committees?
I think it would be ideal if, at the very least, I think we ought to have a deacon on all of the main standing committees. It is not current, I don't think it is currently in our bylaws as such. That would be something, there's a number of things I think we need to address in our bylaws. Whether they ought to be the chair of that committee, again, that would be a question for the bylaw. If we look at bylaws, I wouldn't be opposed to it. I think we ought to have a deacon on one of those, because I think they kind of all exist as an extension of the deacon ministry. Not in necessarily a hierarchical way, but an extension way is probably the best way I would say that. Should they chair it? Maybe, maybe not. I do think they should have a presence there, and whether it's formal or just kind of informal oversight, would be the way I'd answer that. That make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. What else? What other questions or comments? What time is it, by the way? 10 o'clock. Thanks.
I've seen the plurality of elders work pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
I was in a church, it was a Reformed Baptist church that had some major problems, and they only happened after the secondary pastor accepted a position out of state at a different church. And so once that happened, there was no accountability, and the main pastor's, proclivities to a certain attitude toward people, ended up disrupting a lot of things. So yeah, the biblical pattern is, I think, pretty clear, and it's very wise.
Yep. Yep.
So, we all need somebody to bounce things off of,
Yeah, absolutely,
and
absolutely.
it holds us accountable.
Yes. Accountability, no matter where we are, accountability is good. That's always good. I want to touch briefly on congregational authority to then kind of get into, looking at what pastors do and how they help serve that. And so congregational authority is, at the most basic level, it is about exercising the keys of the kingdom. Again, true confessions, true confessors. That is the heart of congregational authority. And so, so not every, congregationalism doesn't mean that the congregation makes every decision. And so, in its most basic form, it means being able to judge true confessions and true confessors. Admitting to the church and exercising the discipline of the church. It doesn't mean that the congregation needs to, make every single decision of the church. I think it's wise that a congregation makes, either makes or has a voice in, one of the two, all the major decisions of the church. And so I think pure democracy, whether you're talking about church or government or whatever, pure democracy is usually bad. It usually devolves into, kind of drifts in towards unfaithfulness, drifts into lowest common denominator stuff. People need to be led. God made us. We need to be led. And so if everything is a democratic vote, like you see that, you can see that nationally, it doesn't go well. And I think you can see that in church as well. And so there does need to be leadership. But a foolish leader would attempt to make all decisions independent of those that he leads. And so I think working for consensus, voice on matters, I think within the context of a church, like any major financial decisions, personnel decisions, facilities, like those type of things, it makes sense that the congregation is either involved in that decision by speaking into it or voting on it or both. So what do pastors do? They're the ones leading in that, and a lot of, particularly in the heavenly affairs, and deacons in the earthly affairs of that. The job of the pastor is to equip the congregation to do the most fundamental task of exercising the keys of the kingdom. How do we do that? Ministry of the word, whether that's both formal and informal. So formal, preaching, teaching. Informal, the formal may be counseling. Informal counseling, just conversations, or just conversations in general where we, apply the word to it, or in meetings with the deacons or the finance committee or whomever, bringing the word to bear on all of those things. That's what that's the ministry of the word, and then also the ministry of prayer. Those are the two things Acts 6 talks about when they bring in the proto-deacons to serve tables, is so that the apostles aren't taken away from the ministry of the word and prayer. Pastors aren't apostles, but they inherit that role, that ministry within each local church. And so I would ask you to, when you pray for me, and please do, pray that I pray. I think the temptations that are for all Christians about being too busy to pray, and that slipping is a temptation. It's a temptation for pastors as well. And so pray that I would pray. And give myself to the ministry of the word and prayer. Then the other thing, it would be the ministry of gathering the flock, protecting the flock. That is what pastors are to do: protect from false teaching, protect from those who would seek to devour, to go after those who are struggling and straying. And that's an area where, to be honest, need to grow and get better at, because there are some of our membership roles that are kind of on the fringe. That's going to happen in any church. but they need the pastoral care, to, like, Jesus, he tells the parable of the shepherd who leaves the 99 to go get the one. So that will be another of the pastor's role there. It's a ministry of the word, ministry of prayer, ministry of gathering and protecting the sheep. That's kind of the threefold ministry of a pastor. Duties, maybe is a better way to say that. Not a dispenser of religious goods and services, not a cruise director of ministry programs. Those things get brought in, but it's important that that doesn't crowd out those main duties. And then lastly, I would say, thinking about pastors and deacons, congregation, just briefly, and Ron will touch more on the congregational aspect next week, but you don't want a passive congregation, but an active one, an involved congregation. You don't want an all-powerful congregation. Again, kind of pure democracy that we're talking about, need to be led. At the same time, you don't want a passive pastor, or group of pastors, nor do you want a domineering one. And so it takes much wisdom in order to kind of, I don't know if I want to use the word balance, but more or less balance all of those things out, in accordance to what are the duties given to us in Scripture, and then let's fulfill those in humility, knowing that ideally all of those things work together. Like pastors and deacons are not at odds. Pastors and congregation or deacon and congregation are not at odds. That we're all, marching in the same direction. And when we go from marching in the same direction to turning on one another, it's because we got sins up there. Because God's design is not, it's not that it's not like government where you have the three branches and they're there to check one another. There's some accountability there between pastors, deacons, and congregation that functions maybe in some similar ways. But the idea isn't that there's going to be necessary conflict and you got to check one another. The idea is that there's differing duties that we must do in order to accomplish our mission. And so we divvy up the labor and all march in the same direction against the same enemy. Does that make sense? Any thoughts, questions, comments before we go? Hearing none, I'll pray and we'll be dismissed. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the church. Lord, I thank you for the deacons you've given to us here at First Baptist. Pray you bless them, give them much wisdom as they lead and by serving in the earthly affairs of the church. And there's a lot of decisions to make particularly, let's say, on a church facility with the age that ours has. Lord, I pray you fill them with wisdom. Lord, as budget season comes up and finance committee works on that, and the deacons are speaking to that by being some of them on that committee. Lord, I pray that you give us wisdom. I pray that you give the church wisdom as we approve a budget, as we admit members, as we whatever comes before the church. Lord, you would fill us with maturity and wisdom, that we would all do our duties well. Lord, I pray that I will minister your word faithfully to this congregation. That we'll be nourished by it, built up in Christ, and be godly. And we ask it in the name of Jesus. Amen.